Pocket Life, Episode 6. Oh, this can't be good. Milo woke up in complete darkness. The space he occupied was silent but for his own breathing, which began to get heavier with anxiety as his senses returned to him. He could feel that his wrists were bound together, as were his ankles. He could feel metal between his hands and assessed that he must be hanging by the wrists from something, hence the feeling that he was floating. His first instinct was to struggle, but he resisted. He had no idea how strong the attachment above him was, or how high up he might be. He had no idea what might be beneath him. He couldn't risk falling. In his mind, he imagined Susan sitting beneath him, with her mouth wide open, just waiting for him to drop down into it. He shuddered and pushed the image away. He hung there in the silence for a few minutes, though it felt like hours. He strained to hear any sound beyond himself and wondered more than once if he was dead. Then he heard the clicking of distant footsteps. A moment later, he heard a door open and a click before his eyes were forced closed by a burst of intense light. He blinked rapidly, unwilling to be blind any longer now that he knew he wasn't alone. Between his blinks, he made out the large female figure heading towards him from about 10 feet away, her heels clicking loudly. After only a moment, he knew everything he needed to know. From the view of the woman, he knew at once that it was Susan, and that he was roughly 5 feet off the ground, which he could tell was something akin to concrete from the sound of Susan's heels. He definitely didn't want to fall. As his eyes adjusted to the light, he became aware that the room he was in had no windows. The walls were plain to his left and in front of him, but for the heavy wooden door directly in front of him. The wall to his right was covered with shelves holding a vast array of what Milo could only describe as junk. It fascinated him how much stuff the big people accumulated. He figured it was to do with having so much space to fill. He was still unable to look behind him because of the way he was hanging. Beyond the open door, he could see a flight of stairs. He guessed he must be in some sort of basement. Susan stopped in front of him, her face filling his field of vision. She smiled at him wickedly as she raised her hand to take hold of his ankles. She pulled on them harshly and caused Milo to swing violently on what he now saw to be a fishing line, its hook holding him aloft. As he swung, he felt sure he would throw up. He became painfully aware of his shoulder, remembering that Susan had dislocated it when she captured him. It seemed she had popped it back into place, but it still hurt like hell as he swung around.
Hello, insect. Did you sleep well? I've been so looking forward to your wake-up call. Are you ready to tell me where I can find the other little people yet?
Milo couldn't help but close his eyes as he swung around. Susan laughed cruelly while he winced in pain. As he slowed down enough to stare into her huge eyes, he scowled at her. "What do you think?" he snapped, before spitting on her cheek. He had been aiming for her eye, but the distance was too great. Susan smirked at him.
Well, I guessed as much. Still, it does mean I get to have my fun while I persuade you.
She walked over to Milo's right and began rummaging with some of the junk on a table that Milo hadn't noticed before. He couldn't see clearly, but he could hear her moving things around that sounded heavy and metallic. He shuddered as she returned to him.
I just have one more thing I need to bring down. Don't you go anywhere now.
She laughed at her joke as she walked back towards the door and disappeared up the stairs. Milo gazed up towards the fishhook holding him aloft. He could see that it was suspended from a ceiling fan. He twisted his wrist to see if he could get a grip on the thing, If he could, then maybe he could free himself and climb the line. But what then? He would just be stuck on the ceiling fan with an even greater drop beneath him. While he thought about it, he twisted his legs as much as he could and felt, to his surprise, that the bonding around his ankles wasn't particularly strong, the knot sliding undone as he wriggled. The string fell away and floated to the ground. Milo became nervous about his wrists now. If her binding was that bad on his wrists too, then he could easily end up falling. Hanging there in the silence, he wondered if falling wouldn't be such a bad thing. Whatever she was going to do to him, it was bound to be worse than dying, and there was a risk that he would break, no matter how strong he thought he was. What if she did manage to get him to tell her how to find Atwanma? That would surely be the worst possible outcome. He couldn't let her find it. He just couldn't. Whatever the cost, he had to defend his family. Just as he had resolved to cause himself to fall, he paused. He remembered one important detail. Even though Susan thought that Avery would have no way of finding him, there was the clue that he had left when he scratched Susan's name into the leg of the chair before she grabbed him. It was a long shot, but if she saw that, she would surely come looking for him, wouldn't she? Although she had been so upset the last time he saw her. Would she even care where he was? He shook his head roughly. Of course she cared. She would be searching for him already by now, surely. He thought about the last time they had talked, how much he'd hurt her. He felt shame flood through him, and he felt like he might cry. Suddenly his moment of reflection was interrupted as Susan stamped down the stairs again. She was carrying a small cardboard box. She marched over to the table, and he saw her tip the contents of the box into a moderately sized glass tank containing odds and ends. He couldn't see what she had put in there, but he could hear it moving, and he shuddered. "Oh, this can't be good," he muttered. Susan strode across the room and grabbed Milo, roughly unhooking him from the fish hook, gashing one of his hands in the process, and Milo gasped at the superficial wound. As she marched back across the room, Milo felt the string from around his wrists fall away. As his stomach lurched, he wasn't sure if it was because of how quickly he was moving, or because he realised just how close he had come to falling to the ground. "So, this is the part where I hurt you until you tell me what I want to know. You get how this works, right?" Susan grinned wickedly at him. "I'm familiar with the concept of torture, yeah. You won't break me though, you ugly cow. Do your worst," Milo snarled back at her, his foolish bravado bursting forth as usual. Still, the skittering sound in the tank beneath him made him nervous. The tank was full of junk, and whatever was in there was hiding, no doubt also traumatized and terrified of Susan. Susan's cruel smile widened. "You really don't know when to quit, do you, bug?" "I'm not a bug," Milo growled, sounding as menacing as a tiny man can in such circumstances. "We'll see. Now, let's see what we can find over here to have some fun." Susan pulled some sticky tape from her pocket, and Milo shuddered. This couldn't be good. Susan dropped him into a large glass jar, about a third full of nails. He landed roughly and ended up with several scrapes from the old nails, but thankfully no serious injuries. He struggled to a seated position on the uneven surface and watched with concern as Susan pulled a strange-looking piece of equipment from one of the shelves on the wall and fixed it to the edge of the table. Milo had never seen a clamp before, and he had no idea of its intended use, and so he assumed this must be some sort of instrument of torture, and in this instance he wasn't wrong. The clamp was fairly small as clamps go, not that this would have been any comfort to Milo. It was fixed to the table now, and Susan pinched Milo's shoulder, lifting him from the jar roughly, before carefully taping his hands and feet to the table beneath the small circular ribbed plate that it used for holding things firmly in place. But not before roughly ripping off Milo's shirt to expose his bare chest. He lay there, looking up at the cold metal. Susan laughed as she looked down at her work so far. "Something funny?" snapped Milo. "Oh, please. Oh, if you could see what I'm seeing, you'd laugh too. If you were a normal-sized person, you'd beat me in any fight. Look at those muscles. And yet, they won't do you any good now." Susan began turning a handle on top of the clamp, and the metal disc began to slowly descend towards Milo. He felt a chill run through him as it approached. "So, where can I find the other little people, insect?" "Go to hell." Milo's voice was far shakier than he would have liked. "Oh no, little bug. You're the one in hell right now. Tell me where they are." The disc edged closer to Milo menacingly. No, I'll never tell you." "We'll see." The plate reached Milo and rested against his chest, and Susan stopped. "Last chance, Grub. Talk now or the real pain begins." You won't kill me, Susan. You need me. You won't crush me with this thing." Susan laughed darkly. "By the time I'm done with you, Milo, you'll wish I'd just killed you." Slowly she turned the handle. The disc lowered some more and Milo felt the pressure start to build on his chest. "Where are they?" "I won't tell you!" He could feel the grip lines on the circle of metal start to dig into his skin as the pressure slowly increased. "Wrong answer." Susan's eyes were dark. "Where are they?" "I won't tell you!" Milo's breaths became shallower and he could no longer fully expand his lungs. "Yes, you will. Where are they?" "I won't tell you!" Milo was beginning to struggle to breathe at all. "Where are they?" I... Milo could no longer draw breath. The pressure on his chest was excruciating. He felt like his lungs were burning as they tried to instinctively gasp for air, but they couldn't. The sharp metal digging into his skin caused tiny streaks of blood to slide down the sides of his chest. He would have felt them trickling down if he hadn't been so preoccupied with his inability to breathe. He was sure he could feel his ribs creaking under the pressure as dark spots began to fill his vision. Then, suddenly, the pressure began to lift. Susan reversed the turning handle and the plate slowly rose away from him. As his lungs were allowed to slowly fill with air, Milo's vision began to clear. Once he was able to, he gasped for breath. He could feel the cuts across his chest now. They stung as they were exposed to the air. Susan reached down and pulled him roughly from the tape. "Are you ready to talk yet?" Milo took several deep breaths and nodded. Yeah, I'll tell you. I'll tell you what you need to know." His voice was quiet, defeated, and Susan pulled him closer to her face instinctively. You really need a plastic surgeon or something, you ugly cow." And with that, he spat in her eye. Susan pulled him away from her face, rubbing her eye urgently with her free hand. She scowled at him. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" "I confess it's one of my greatest strengths," Milo snapped. Susan grinned. "You think you're so brave, don't you? But you forget. We've been here before." Milo glanced around in confusion. "No, we haven't." Susan rolled her eyes. "Not here in this room, silly bug. Here in this position. Me in control and you at my mercy." "Ah, Yes, I see your mistake, Susan. No, you have no mercy, you evil. That's
not the point, she cut across him. My point is, I know what you're most afraid of me doing.
Milo swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about, he said shakily.
I think you do,
murmured Susan, as a wicked smile filled her face.
You know, you really do look delicious.
With that, Susan stuffed the little man into her mouth whole. Milo panicked as Susan's mouth closed around him and darkness smothered him. Her mouth was hot and wet, and he felt her saliva soak quickly into his remaining clothes. Susan pressed Milo to the roof of her mouth with her tongue, as a chuckle sounded from deep within her throat, shaking Milo to his core. Her tongue was rough and it shifted menacingly. He could feel the cage of her teeth all around him, apart from the ominous space in front of him, and he was terrified that she would swallow him alive. The thought of sliding down her hot throat to plunge into the stomach full of acid made him choke as he vaguely wondered if he would drown in there before his body dissolved. The pressure from her tongue increased, Milo's face pressed into its rough surface, unable to breathe once again for lack of space and the pressure on his lungs. He struggled as hard as he could, but he barely moved. Susan's sadistic chuckle shook through his body again, and his head spun, and he was sure he would pass out this time. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it was over. Susan pulled him out of her mouth and dropped him back onto the table as she laughed at him cruelly.
You know, Bug, you really do taste delicious.
Milo panted for breath, unable to respond to her taunt.
Are you ready to tell me where your family are yet, insect?
Milo pushed himself to his feet. Go directly to hell, he snarled breathlessly.
Now, that's not very nice, is it? And I was very nice to you just then, don't you think?
Susan feigned feeling hurt. You're kidding, right? You think eating someone is nice? I reiterate, woman, your breath stinks. Next time have a mint or something first, would you? Susan's eyes narrowed.
Again with the wit. You never learn, do you? At least I didn't chew you up or swallow you, stupid little worm. When will you learn to behave?
I'm not sure it's my behaviour we should be concerned about, Milo shouted. Whatever was in the tank beside him moved when Milo shouted, and both torturer and victim looked towards it. Milo still couldn't see what it was, and wondered what its purpose here was. Susan looked back at Milo and smiled wickedly.
Perhaps it's time you meet my friend. Her name is Penny, and I'm sure she will persuade you to talk to me.
Susan scooped up the tiny man and dropped him into the middle of the glass tank, slamming the lid down with satisfaction.
I'll let you two get to know each other. I'm going for some lunch. Bye-bye, little bug. Don't die in there, will you? I'm not done with you yet.
Susan marched over to the door and slammed it behind her, thankfully leaving the light on as Milo heard her clacking footsteps ascend the stairs. Milo stood up, as slowly and silently as he could. The tank was full of odds and ends, most of them rusted and covered in cobwebs. It smelled musty, like a place that has been vacant for a long time. He turned around on the spot slowly, looking for any sign of whoever or whatever Penny was. He heard something metallic move behind him, and he spun around to see his fellow prisoner peeking out at him from behind a mouldy cardboard box that once contained nails. Penny was a brown and white adolescent rat, her fur thin with mange, her stomach thin with neglect, her ribs showing rather more clearly than they should do through her rough skin. She was very obviously a domestic rat, but she had clearly been mistreated, which wasn't really a surprise given what Milo knew about her owner. Her big black eyes stared at Milo with indecision. He could see it. She was scared of him, but she was starving, and he most definitely counted as food. He guessed which instinct was likely to win out. "Hi, Penny. It's okay. I don't want to hurt you, okay? And you don't have to hurt me either, okay? Okay? I'll get us out of here, and then..." Penny started to creep towards him, sharp front teeth catching the limited light ominously. She'd made up her mind. Milo and Penny jumped at the same moment, Milo narrowly avoiding her overlong claws. He dived into a rusting tin can, scrambling all the way through it. She followed him easily. He clambered up the mouldy nail box, thinking if he could stand on top of it, he could maybe reach the lid of the tank. Penny tried to follow him. He kicked frantically at her face and knocked her off balance. She scampered away from him, pawing at her nose, squeaking in fear and frustration. Milo knew he didn't have long. He stood on the lid of the box, which itself was about twice his height. He reached towards the glass lid of the tank, but before he could touch it, the cardboard beneath his feet gave way, and he tumbled into the box, landing on his back with a thud that knocked the air out of him. He heard Penny race over to the box, her powerful teeth suddenly gnawing at his flimsy fortress. As he pushed himself up into a seated position, his hand connected with rough metal. A single rusty nail remained in the box. In proportion to Milo, it was like a short sword. Light began to break into the box as Penny made more holes in it. She would be on him soon. He looked at the nail, feeling sick. He really didn't want to do this. Penny squeaked triumphantly as she peered through one of the holes and saw her meal. Milo acted, knowing this might be his only chance. With all his might, he thrust the nail into Penny's eye, the aim being to pierce her brain and hopefully finish her quickly. To his surprise, as her eye exploded, the nail struck the inside of her eye socket, and Milo was pushed back as the nail rebounded. Penny squealed and fell away from him, scurrying to the far corner of the tank and squeaking in pain. Milo panted for breath and held back a sob. He knew what it was to kill or be killed. This wasn't an entirely new situation to him. He just hated having to hurt an innocent creature that only wanted to hurt him because she had been abused herself. Time ticked on, and all was quiet for a while. Milo had stayed in the battered box, nervous of what waited outside. Penny was silent now. He wondered if the shock might have killed her. Maybe she'd bled out from the wound to her eye. He was contemplating going to find out. The more he thought about it, the less he wanted to. He was so tired. All the adrenaline that had been coursing through him was fading away, and all he wanted to do was close his eyes. Maybe he would die in his sleep. Maybe it could just be over. By now he thought he might be okay with that. His eyes were heavy. They drooped down as sleep beckoned him. An angry squeak shook him awake as claws and teeth assaulted the box once more, and this time the whole thing crumbled. Gripping his nail, Milo dived away from the angry rodent as she tried desperately to take a bite out of him. He tried to dash back through the rusty tin can, but she bit at his leg and pulled him back, her teeth snagging on his trousers and ripping the left leg of them clean off. Milo was on his back, dragging himself away from her. As Penny angrily pulled the fabric from her teeth, she squeaked in anger, turning and jumping onto the tiny man. As she leapt, Milo raised the nail and took aim, Penny's own momentum driving the nail into her tiny heart. She fell away from him, her squeaks of anger shattering into squeals of pain. Milo panted for breath once again. He felt tears streaming down his cheeks. He sat up and looked across the tank to where Penny lay. He walked over to her. Her remaining eye looked up at him, filled with fear and frustration. He knelt down beside her and gently stroked the fur above her eye. "I'm so sorry, Penny. I wish we could both survive this. I'll teach that awful cow a lesson, you mark my words. I'll show her." He watched as the light flickered out in Penny's eye. It was hours before Susan came back. Milo worried that she would be angry about her rat, but to his surprise she seemed more relieved to see him alive. "Well, don't you look a mess, insect. I was a little concerned that maybe my little friend would eat you before I could make you talk. But I see I should have started you off against a cat or something." "Just kill me, Susan," Milo replied weakly. "You won't make me talk." Susan cackled wickedly. No. I did some out-of-the-box thinking while you were making friends with Penny. Milo felt sick. He just wanted it to be over. What else could she be planning? What more could she do to him now? "There's someone else I'd like you to meet. Don't worry, though. This one won't try to eat you." Probably. Susan brought a wooden chair from the back of the room and placed it by the wall beside the table. Milo watched her through the glass of his prison and assumed she would sit down, but she didn't. She went back up the stairs, returning with a human. The human was bound at the wrists, their head covered in a brown sack, and had clearly been drugged. Milo felt his body begin to shake. Susan sat the person down on the chair and tied them to it, before removing the sack from their head with a flourish. But Milo didn't need her to reveal the face. He knew what she'd done. "You let her go right now," he shouted. "I'll kill you, Susan. I swear I will murder you, you filthy, stinking witch. I'll tear your heart out. You let her go right now. Do you hear me?" He was hammering on the glass with his fists, angry tears filling his eyes again. "Oh, I'll let her go. Don't worry. As long as you tell me what I need to know. Just tell me where they are, Milo. And no one needs to get hurt. Otherwise, I may need to try out my torture techniques on Avery here. By the way, does the soldier boy know you're in love with his bride-to-be?" Milo was seething. He had to fix this, he had to. "I'll tell you what," Susan murmured. "I'll leave you two to get accustomed to the situation, shall I? I'm sure you'll talk to save her, won't you, insect? I'm certain you will." And Susan left them again, flicking off the light and plunging the pair into darkness. Milo's angry scream echoed to silence.